Now, for the image, of course, you could think about using the device camera. And I'll have a whole module where we dive into how to use the device camera. Here, I want to focus on getting user input, and therefore here we'll simply add a text field where the user has to enter a URL. Now again, we'll later learn how to use the device camera nonetheless. Now I think for something like the image, it would be nice if we don't just have a text input where the user enters a URL, but if we also show a preview of the entered image so that the user can quickly check whether that image is correct and so on. So therefore, now as a new input here, I'll not directly add a text form field, but a row, since I want to have two items sit next to each other. And that's also something you can do. Inside of form, you're not restricted to just having text form fields. And actually, we already have a list view in there. You can use any widget you want. Form then just works together with text form fields. It ignores other widgets, so to say. Therefore, here we can add a row. And in that row, I want to have two things. I want to have a container, which should in the end show a preview of the image the user chose. And then I want to have the text form field, which allows the user to enter a URL. Let's start with the container. I'll give it a width of 100 and a fixed height of 100. So that will be the box in which the image should be previewed. And I'll add a margin here of edge insets only because I want to have some margin to the top of, let's say, 8 and to the right of 10. On the right of that container will be the text input, and on top of it will be the prior text input here. So with that distance added to the surrounding elements, I also want to add a little decoration here, a little border to be precise. You learned that you can create a decoration for a container by setting the decoration argument here to a box decoration object, and on there you can add a border with the border argument, and then simply create a border on all sides with border.all, give it a width of, let's say, 1, and a color maybe of colors gray to have a light gray border around that container. And the child now, of course, should be the image. That's something I'll do later. For now, I'll just render an empty container, so I'll not render anything, because we first of all need to work on the text form field to have an image to show there. So on this text form field, the decoration now will be an input decoration where I set a label text of image URL to make it clear what the user should enter there. Now, besides the decoration here, I want to have a keyboard type which supports entering a URL because I want to have a text input type of URL, which gives us a soft keyboard that is particularly well suited to entering URLs. I also want to assign a text input action, and here the text input action should be done. So it should show this done text or this check mark, which makes clear that when you now hit enter, you try to submit that form. Of course, you don't have to use that, but I think it makes sense for the last input we have. Now, I won't add a focus node here because we can't go there from the previous input because that was that multi-line input here. And therefore, we're done with this, but I want to do something different here on that text form field. Now, in general, the form manages our values. We're not using that yet when we submit everything, but in general, you can rely on that being the case, and you don't need to add your own text editing controllers to get access to the values of your inputs. That's good. But here for the image text form field, I actually do want to get access to the input the user entered before the form is submitted because I want to show a preview here in that container. So for that text form field down there, for the image URL text form field, I do want to add my own text editing controller. So I'll add a new property, which is my image URL controller, where I create a new text editing controller like this. And just as with the focus node, you should, by the way, also dispose of that here in your dispose method. So of the image URL controller. So the image URL controller is now something I can assign here to the controller key on the text form field. Like this. Again, you don't have to do that if you just want to get the value when the form is submitted, but here I want to have it before the form is submitted, and therefore I do need to add it here. Now that image URL controller here is updated when we type into the text form field. So we can now use it, or the value stored in it, here in our container where we want to preview the image. Therefore here, instead of showing an empty container, we can check if the image URL controller text is empty, which means we don't have a URL yet. And if that's the case, we maybe show a text widget where we say enter a URL. But otherwise, if it's not empty, so here in the else case, I want to render a fitted box here which contains my image as a child. And here I'll create an image widget with image network because I expect the image URL. So image network is the right way of creating an image here. And there I then take the image URL controller text, which we checked that it's not empty. Of course, it could be an invalid URL, but well, then it will simply not render an image here. That's okay here. Of course, you could add an extra check here and check whether it is a valid URL, but I'll leave that out for now. I want to add my fit here on the image widget which we're creating and set this to box fit cover now. With that, if we save that, and I go to creating a new product here, we actually don't see anything on the screen. The reason for that is that we have an error, and if we scroll to the top of that error, we learn that an input decorator, which is created by a text field, cannot have an unbounded width. So we have the problem with the width of some text form field. Obviously, it has to be that field because before we added that, everything worked. And indeed, the problem here is that the text form field sits inside of a row. And something you didn't know before, because I haven't told you, is that the text form field by default takes as much width as it can get. And the problem with that is that if it's inside of a row as we have it here, a row has an unconstrained width. So normally the boundaries of the device width are, well, the boundaries of the text form field, but the row doesn't have these boundaries. It doesn't have the device width as an internal boundary. And therefore text form field tries to take an infinite amount of width. Solution is simple. We can wrap this with a new widget, and there, for example, we can take the expanded widget if we want to. If we now save this, now here we see the image URL, and next to it we see a box which should eventually show a preview. Now I also want to change how that is positioned, and for that I'll go to the row, and I want to align items differently on the cross axis, which on a row is from top to bottom. I want to set the cross axis alignment here to end, to move it all to the end. So now if we save that, the image URL thing here is simply pushed down to the end of that box and aligned with the end of our container, which looks better in my opinion. Well, and with that, let's try adding a URL now. And for that, I simply grabbed some URL. You can do the same with the help of Google image search or anything like that. Copied that and then simply long press here to paste it. And if we confirm with the check mark, this is shown. So now we see our preview here. Now important, of course, this didn't update with every keystroke here, but only after we submitted this with the check mark which closes the keyboard, which of course is fine here. It gives the user time to enter a full URL. Now one thing you could want about that image URL is that you actually don't need to hit this button here in the bottom right to see the preview, but that you also see the preview if this loses focus. So if you go to another input, for example, I think that would be an expected behavior of this app. Now, Flutter doesn't have a default listener for when this loses focus, but you can set up your own listener with the help of a focus node. So let's add a new focus node here for the image, an image URL focus node, which we create here with the focus node class. And of course, just as before, we have to dispose of that when the state object gets destroyed. So here is my image URL focus node, and I call dispose on it inside of the dispose method. And now we can use that image URL focus node not to request focus for it once we're done with the description. As mentioned before, that's not really possible. But we can nonetheless add this focus node here to our text form field for the image URL, because we can now set our own listener. And when this loses focus, so when the user unselected it, then we can react to this to, well, make sure that we update the UI and use the image URL controller to show a preview. So for that, we need to set up our own listener to the image URL focus node. It's attached to that text form field down there, and therefore it keeps track of whether that's focused or not. So we just need to listen to changes in that focus. For that, init state is a good place to set up that initial listener. So here in init state, I can set up my image URL focus node, add listener. So with the add listener, we add a new listener to that focus node, and we point at a function here that should be executed whenever the focus changes. For that, I'll add a new method here, which doesn't return anything, which I'll name update image URL underscore update image URL. And I point at this underscore update image URL function here with add listener. I don't execute it here because I don't want to execute it when this gets parsed, when this gets read. I just want to use the pointer at this function to tell Flutter that I want Flutter to execute this update image URL function whenever the focus changes here. Now, important, we also have to clear that listener when we dispose of that state. Otherwise, the listener keeps on living in memory, even though the page is not presented anymore. And that again creates a memory leak. So in dispose, to be super safe, before you dispose of the image URL focus node, I would recommend that you call remove listener and simply also point at update image URL. And therefore it will remove that listener that uses this function from the image URL focus node. Well, with that, in the update image URL function, we simply have to check if we're not having focus anymore. So if the image URL focus node does not have focus, and this will be fired if it had focus and we then click somewhere else. And if we don't have focus anymore, so we lost focus, then we want to update the UI and use the latest state stored in the image URL controller. And for that, we can simply call set state like this. It's a bit of a hack because we don't update this state ourselves, but we know that the state has updated, that we have an updated value in image URL controller, and we want to rebuild the screen to reflect that updated value in image URL controller, since that value in image URL controller is the image we want to preview. So with this change, if we go back to this page, now if I tab in there and out of there, you see no update because we entered nothing. But if I now paste in my URL and I then tab into a different field, you see that preview. So now we get that preview when we lose focus, which I think is closer to the expected behavior. And with that, we finished the inputs. They generally work correctly, but of course we're not submitting them, we're not getting their data, and we're not validating them. So these will be the next steps.